let us know when that has happened.
Working on it right now. Give me 1 second.
It looks like we're good to go.
Are we good to go?
Mhm.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so very much. You are now, I should say you have joined Northwest Indiana Green Drinks this evening. And I want to welcome everyone who is here on Zoom and those who are joining us on Facebook Live this evening. We have a very exciting program scheduled for you. And it's entitled Lydick Bog, the Discovering and Making of a Nature Preserve. And Steve Sass is here to present for us. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge who our sponsors are and also who our guest hosts are this month. And then after I do that, I'll be handing it off to Katie Hobgood of Save the Dunes, and she'll be doing some housekeeping items for us. And then after we've accomplished that, we'll be ready to start our formal presentation this evening. So I want to acknowledge our ongoing sponsors, and that is Save the Dunes. And Dylan, Katie, and Harshini are here with us, representing the staff of Save the Dunes this evening. Michigan City Sustainability Commission. I believe I'm the one that's representing us tonight. And then we're supported by 219 Green Connect, and that's Kathy Sippel's organization. And they provide us with all of our social media platforms and also our MailChimp ability to send to you an email about our upcoming events. And then we remind you the day of so you don't forget about it. And then finally, our guest hosts this month are 95.1 FM AM, 1420 WIMS. That's Rick Federici. And he radiocasts in Northwest Indiana, Southwestern Michigan. I believe he goes a little bit into the Chicagoland.
Nancy, you muted yourself. Oh, Dylan, I think you need to make her a co-host so that she can unmute herself. That'll fix that. Okay, Nancy, try to unmute yourself now.
Okay, I'm good.
Yeah.
Where do I need to pick up at? Okay, I'll just start with our sponsors and I'll just go through it real quickly, okay? Our sponsors are Save the Dunes, Michigan City Sustainability Commission, and 219 Green Connect. Our guest hosts this month are 95.1 FM AM 1420 WIMS, Shirley Heinze Trust, and In Nature. So I would recommend everybody go ahead and check out their Facebook pages and or their websites to learn more about our guest hosts this month. Okay, I think that's what, I always need to acknowledge this is our 10th year that we've been holding Northwest Indiana Green Drinks, and thanks to all of you who join us ongoingly and have been extremely supportive by being either presenters or attending our sessions. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart that we have this venue available. Okay, Katie, I'm going to hand it over to you for housekeeping.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. So we are being broadcast live on Facebook. The recording of this presentation is going to live on the Save the Dunes Facebook page, as well as our YouTube page. So if you would like to rewatch and share with your friends, that is where you will find it. I'm going to ask everybody who is on Zoom with us today to keep yourselves muted. Well, we've taken away that permission, haven't we? So you are going to be muted during our presentation, just to cut back on any background noise. We will give you back that permission at the end. So if you would like to unmute yourself and ask questions at that point, you are welcome to do that. We also encourage you to drop your questions into the chat, or if you're watching over on Facebook, to type out your questions into the comments, and we will address those after our presentations. I think my dogs say I'm done. I think that covers everything. And I'll hand it back to you, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Katie. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing Steve, but I'll have to say he's probably one of the most enthusiastic people that I know about moss and also native plants and about landscape preservation. He's off the chart in all three of those areas. And besides knowing him in this capacity, I'll have to say that I do count him as one of my good friends. And I want to thank him for our friendship and for being willing to go to extremely hard to reach and far away places. And this is one of the things he's going to be talking about this evening. Lydick Bog in and of itself is so precious and so valuable. But when you learn from Steve, the adventure that he took and the journey that brought this extremely rare and valuable bog to the point of actually being a nature preserve with Shirley Heinze Land Trust. It's remarkable, and I'm going to say it's a miracle also. So Steve, without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to you, and I'm also going to make a shameless plug for In Nature. And if people don't know about this group on Facebook or on the web, their website, you really do want to check out In Nature after we're finished. Okay, thank you. Steve, you have your 40 minutes.
Okay, I'm setting my timer right now. I'm going to go quickly because I've got a lot to go through, but thank you so much for inviting me to do this. This is a program that I have never done before. I've told the story numerous times, but I've never been able to tell the story in this format where I'm using images and graphics. Usually I'm out at the bog doing hikes out there, and folks inevitably want to know how in the world this came to be. In fact, I was out there hiking last night, and I ran across a gentleman from Stark County who I happened to casually mention that I was one of the people that that helped to protect this place and discover it. And he looked at me and he said, "How in the world do you discover something like this?" And I said, "Well, I'm glad you asked, and I'm going to be doing a program about just that." So anyway, we're going to move along quickly. Oh, I need to share my screen, don't I? That would help, wouldn't it? Let's see. Okay. Let me know if you have it. Okay, super. Thank you so much. Okay, so I want to start by having a really cool Save the Dunes tie-in to Lydick Bog. And you may wonder, what in the world does Save the Dunes have to do with Lydick Bog? Maybe some of you are familiar with this iconic photo from July 23rd, 1961. Early on, or I guess probably mid on in the Save the Dunes movement, this was a relatively famous event that took place where we had a number of notable people driving this Jeep down along Lake Michigan to raise awareness for saving the dunes and eventually creating the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, which of course now is the Indiana Dunes National Park. So the dignitaries that are in this photograph. We have Senator Paul Douglas, of course, riding in the passenger seat of the Jeep. We have several of the area's mayors, the mayors of Hammond and Gary, and of course, Chicago Mayor Daley, East Chicago Mayor. We have, of course, Herb Reed. I'm sure a lot of you knew Herb. He was very special to Northwest Indiana. And then highlighted with this red arrow, we have Floyd Swink, who was a botanist. He almost looks like he was kind of detached riding there in the back seat of the Jeep. But he was a very notable botanist from the Morton Arboretum. Actually, he was self-taught. He was a brilliant individual. He was a speed typer. He could type 160 words per minute. He would do tricks where he could balance quarters on his knuckles and type words backwards. And he was really something. But what he's known for probably the most is creating this book called Plants of the Chicago Region, which was first published in 1969. And Floyd updated it in 1974. And then in 1979, he brought in a co-author, and that's Gerald Wilhelm, or Jerry Wilhelm, on the right side of this photo with Floyd. And they also updated that book to the 4th edition in 1994. And then in 2000, in August of 2000, Floyd Swink passed away suddenly. And it was obviously a great loss for Chicagoland botany and natural heritage, because he was really one of the world's foremost botanists at the time. And at the time of his death, Jerry Wilhelm, I overheard him saying in a program that I was with him once, that he thought that this was going to be the end of Plants of the Chicago Region, because without Floyd, there was no way of continuing onward. And what changed that was the lady who's on the left-hand side of this photo. And hopefully these things there's not a lag on these photographs, but I'll try to talk a little bit slower and give the photos a chance to load. So that's Jerry Wilhelm on the right in 2014. And then to his left is a young botanist named Laura Ririca. And she worked at the Cook County Forestry. She was also a protege of Floyd Swink. And before he passed, she spent a lot of time with him learning botany and plants from him. And so she convinced Jerry to produce a 5th edition of Plants of the Chicago Region. She's more of an entomologist by trade, apparently. So they incorporated insect associations with it. And you haven't seen this book. It came out several years ago. It's called now The Flora of the Chicago Region. It's really not a field guide. It weighs about 10 pounds, and it's not something you'd put into a backpack or anything like that and take out in the field with you. But it's a very comprehensive book on all of the plants that are native and naturalized to the Chicago region. So the process of updating this book was very slow. It took, I want to say, over 5 years for the two of them to update the 4th edition to the 5th edition. And one of the things that they did was they went through every species of plant, species by line, and wrote updates, like what has changed between 1994 and 2017, I believe is when this was published. Have the plants has the distribution of the plant increased, decreased? Is it no longer around? Is it an invasive plant that just occurred between then and now? So they went through everything, species by species. And one of the plants that they came to was this plant called Schutzerria palustris, which is a very unusual plant. We'll see a photograph of it in a minute here. And we have the 1974, 1979, and 1994 editions where they talk about Schutzerria palustris. And you can see the counties are marked where it was historically found. And when Jerry was updating the book, he got to Schutzerria palustris. He called a northern Indiana botanist, well-known botanist, Scott Namisnik, who I'm sure many of you also know. And he asked Scott if he had ever seen Schutzarea palustris in the Chicago region. Scott replied that he had not seen it, but that he had remembered reading about it somewhere. This next slide is a photograph of the plant. It's a very unassuming plant it really grows only in bogs. It has several different common names, including bog arrowgrass and rannoch rush. Very small, it's not showy. It's neither a grass nor a rush, interestingly enough. It's in its own family, Schuttzeriaceae. It's the only member of that entire family. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the Biota of North America project map where it shows the distribution of it. So it's primarily more of a northern species. The yellow that you see on the Indiana counties means that there were historical records for the plant, and the yellow coloration means that it's rare in that particular state. So when you get up into Michigan, it's green. Again, more of a northerly plant. It's more common there, but in Indiana, it's really kind of at the southern end of its range. So Scott remembered that he had read about it in a public called the American Midland Naturalist. And on the left, we have a photo of a priest from Notre Dame. This is Father Julius Newland. He lived in the late 1800s and passed away in 1936. He was both a botanist and a chemist at the University of Notre Dame. Most notably, he is known for being one of the people who paved the way towards the invention of synthetic rubber, which wound up being critical to the Allied efforts in World War II, as the world's rubber supply was cut off by the Axis forces. Unfortunately, Father Newland passed away in 1936, and he never lived to see his invention be one of the components that made the Allies successful in World War II. So the American Midland Naturalist was a publication that he started in the early 1900s because one of his friends told him that there really isn't very much documentation of plants going on in the middle part of the country. We had publications in the West and in the East, but not so much in the middle. So he wrote a column for this. He was the editor and he was also an author, and he wrote a column called Notes on Local Plants. And in the January 1913, I believe, edition, I think that's why I put that cover on there, he wrote about Schutzarea palustris, and he mentioned a few places in northern Indiana where other people had found it. And then he goes on to mention Chain Lakes, Indiana, parentheses, St. Joseph County, where he's collected it. And so I put together a little map of some of the places where he mentioned that he had found it and where others had found it. So Clark and Hessler had both found it in Marshall County. Hessler just says Marshall County. H.W. Clark says at Lake Maxinkuckee, which is at Culver down in Marshall County. And Baston collected it in what they called Millers, Indiana at the time. Again, this was before Gary even existed when that was collected. And then Newland over there in the Chain Lakes region of St. Joe County. So what is the Chain Lakes region of St. Joe County? Well, if we zoom in on the map here, we can see the area that I've drawn the rectangle around. There are a series of lakes that run north to south along there. So, and as it turns out, I live just to the west of there, a couple of miles west of there. So it's an area that I'm very familiar with. There are some notable things in the Chain Lakes area. The South Bend Country Club is on one of the lakes. Elbel Park Golf Course, which is a South Bend City golf course, is on one of the northerly lakes called Mud Lake. And these lakes were, as a result, like all of our geological features, of the glaciers, right? The last ice age. And so I drew this map of, or superimposed this map of the Laurentide ice sheet on top of the outline of the states. And where I put that star at is basically right smack dab in that Chain Lakes region of St. Joseph County. So you can see it's basically where the Saginaw lobe, which eventually formed portions of Lake Huron, and met with the Lake Michigan lobe, which then, of course, formed Lake Michigan. And I dug a little bit deeper onto this and took a look closer at just St. Joseph County and superimposed some morainal maps and some geological features. You can see the chain lakes up here at the top left, and it's right on the edge of that Kalamazoo moraine. So we have, geologically, these moraines are the margins of the glaciers where significant amounts of till were deposited as the glaciers retreated. And in the case of these chain of lakes, and some of them we refer to them kind of colloquially as the kettle lakes of Northwest St. Joe County, but they're technically really not all kettle lakes. So if you can imagine, as these glaciers are retreating, these enormous chunks of ice are breaking off of the glaciers, and the glaciers are a mile or more tall. So enormous amounts of mass and ice that break off, and as they hit the ground, they're creating these indentations that are the size and the shape of the ice that falls off. And so, interestingly enough, this was another graphic that I added kind of as a side note. As the Lake Michigan lobe and the Saginaw lobe retreated, the water started finding its own way of flowing out of the area. And it resulted in these two different watersheds that split St. Joseph County right in half. So the bluish purple watershed is the St. Joe or the Great Lakes watershed. And then the greenish coloration is the Kankakee watershed. So a drop of water that goes into the green area is going to flow down to the Gulf of Mexico, versus a drop of water in the blue area is going to flow into the Great Lakes. And where I put that star, if you've ever driven in South Bend on the US 20 bypass, you may have come across that sign that's on there that says North-South Continental Divide. And this is the spot that's on the map on the bypass where those two different watersheds meet up at. So we get a lot of, inevitably, when I do tours of the bog out there, I get a lot of, the first question that people want to know is what the heck is a tamarack bog? So I should back up. When talking about Father Newland, he mentioned that where he had seen this plant, Schutzera palustris, was in tamarack bogs in the Chain Lakes region. So what then is a tamarack bog? So if we think about how a bog is formed, remember those chunks of ice that have fallen off of the glaciers create different sizes and shapes of lakes. Now, on this particular lake, which will eventually be a bog, it doesn't have any source of groundwater, so there are no springs and there are no streams that are flowing into the lake. So the only water, the only precipitation that's coming into this bog or into this lake, is rainwater, as well as some runoff that's coming from the surrounding hills that are typical around these kettle lakes, where they're surrounded by the kind of a hilly area that would lead into them. So as the aquatic vegetation starts to form on this lake, the lake starts becoming more and more acidic, because groundwater tends to be alkaline versus rainwater tends to be acidic. And without the influx of groundwater, we're getting more and more acidic as time goes on. And with the acid water, along with the absence of turbidity, right? So because there's no streams flowing into this or springs coming into this, the water is relatively stagnant, which means that it becomes less and less aerobic. So there's less oxygen in the water, and the aerobic bacteria, which are the bacteria that decompose things, can't survive in this ecosystem. And so what happens is that the vegetation, as it dies, it decomposes at a much slower rate than it would on a lake that was full of aerobic bacteria. And so as this vegetation starts to break down slowly, it forms what we call peat, which is partially decomposed plant material. And as time goes on, the peat will increase in size and in height to the point where it will eventually fill in the lake, which is what we have at Lydick Bog. But so we have a low pH again, and it's covered by this peat mat. And because this peat mat is actually sitting up on top of the lake, the groundwater nutrients and minerals from below the lake aren't able to make it up onto the peat mat. So it's a very inhospitable environment for plants to grow in. The low pH coupled with the mineral depleted substrate means that not very many things can grow there. Some of the things that can grow there have adapted over long periods of time, and we'll look at a few of those plants and some of their strategies. So anyway, essentially that's a bog, and so in the course of the past, well, 15 or 16,000 years, when the last ice sheet retreated up until now, we went from an open lake into something that looks like what we see in this picture. This is a photo of this is Mud Lake Bog in County, Michigan, and the trees that we see on the right-hand side of the photo are tamaracks. Tamaracks are one of the only trees that can live in a bog, and in fact, it's one of the only places that they can live. These are they're conifers that are deciduous, so they lose their needles completely every year and grow new ones in the spring. So this is what a tamarack bog would look like, for example. We have a few of such bogs in Northwest Indiana, most notably the one that I just talked about, Mud Lake Bog, is up between Buchanan and Galeen. There is Thompson Bog, which is a state dedicated nature preserve over in Rolling Prairie, and Elkhart Bog, which is over by the RV Hall of Fame and kind of in that region, if you know Elkhart at all, northeast portion of Elkhart, which by the way now has a brand new boardwalk that was built by the DNR. And then of course Pinhook Bog, which we know from the Indiana Dunes National Park. So where in this particular area could there possibly be a remnant tamarack bog? So the yellow star represents approximately where I live, and the orange star represents an area that I have driven by just about every day for the last 25 years or so on my way into South Bend. And again, it's just west of the airport there. And that area, this is obviously a Google Street View of it. It's this is Highway 20, US 20, as evidenced by, it was a part of the original Lincoln Highway, as evidenced by the Ken Rose Motel. We used to have these roadside motels all over the place in the Lincoln Highway. On the right-hand side of the photo, and unfortunately we can't really see it very well from the Google Street View, there is a wetland. You can see a wetland back there, and I knew about this wetland. I always drove past it, and in fact, back in 2008 or 2009, I was doing some volunteer work with the Nature Conservancy, and I asked the site steward for St. Joe County if he knew anything about this particular area, and he replied that he knew where I was talking about, but that and they had gone there to look at it, but there was nothing that was exceptional about it, and so I kind of let that go. So so Scott then called me, because Scott, remember, was tasked by Jerry Wilhelm to try to see if he could find this plant in the area. And he asked me if I knew of where there was a tamarack bog, and I kind of pointed him to that spot. And we got on Google Earth. This was, I think, June of 2014. And that orange arrow points to the area where he decided that was a bog. It looked really good for a bog. And I asked him kind of why he felt that way, and we zoomed in a little bit farther, and those little dark circles he thought were tamarack trees, which is pretty incredulous to think that you could identify something like a tamarack tree from a Google Earth image, but it clearly is something there. It's not open water, and you can see there's a grade change, and it's very different looking from the other vegetation that's nearby there. And so what we decided we were going to do is we were going to go take a look at it. And the best idea that we came up with is we were going to put in my canoe over at Bass Lake, which is just to the south of it. And we were going to paddle up through that little northeast islet of Bass Lake. And we were going to dock the canoe and we were going to get out and we were going to walk right into the bog. And that sounded good on paper. But what we actually wound up finding was that there was a lot of dense vegetation and spatterdock, and there was really no firm ground to land on. And there were neighbors over there that were looking at us. And so we aborted mission that day. That's my daughter, Sarah, who was, I think, about 12 years old at the time, and a pretty good adventurer and a good sport. But we never made it into the bog on that particular day. But Scott called me later that day, and he had not given up. In fact, he had driven around there some more and reported that he thought that he had found a way to get into the bog. And this map shows the idea for his route, that we were going to park our cars over there at the bottom there where the red is at, or where the arrows public boat launch parking lot, and we were going to walk along these county roads, and then it dead ended, and it looked like there was a little 2-track that led up a hill, and we were going to get into the bog that way. And so I said, well, sure, I'm game with that. And in the meantime, he had contacted the Division of Nature Preserves, his contacts down there. Roger Hedge, who is a heritage biologist, he's retired now for the Division of Nature Preserves. And Roger decided that if we're going to go do this, that he'd like to come along as well. And so the three of us on August 18th, 2014, we made this trek. Unfortunately, I don't have any photos to show of the hardships of getting through some of the shrubs and the moat that was around that day. But this is a little bit of us trying to fight our way through some of the vegetation, and the water was down above our thighs. It was very hot. It was August, of course, in full sun. And eventually we started seeing sphagnum moss, which is a characteristic species of a bog. It grows on top of the peat. And we could see there was an opening ahead. And sure enough, the next thing you know, we were standing on this floating mat. Now, I should note that this floating mat is, this is what's called a quaking bog, meaning that you can kind of bounce up and down and you can see vegetation moving 50 feet away from you because it's all attached to this floating mat. It's about 3 feet thick and is potentially a lot of water. So we didn't know exactly how much water, and it's probably a good thing. So we were out there for, oh gosh, probably 2.5, 3 hours, something like that on that particular day. And following our visit there, Scott and Roger, who were the real botanists of the group, they were the ones who were down on the ground looking for things and recording things and knew exactly what things were when they were finding them. As this initial plant inventory from that day, we came away with 7 ETR species, which are endangered, threatened, or rare in Indiana, including one species that was considered to be state extirpated, meaning not found at all anymore in the state of Indiana. Carnivorous plants are present there, and this goes back to this nutrient depleted ecosystem of a bog. The plants have to find alternative means of increasing their nutrient intake, and they do so. Some of them do so by ingesting insects. These photos are both from Lydick Bog. We have the round leaf sundew on the left, which captures insects by emitting a sticky substance that the insects can't get away from, and they're slowly then digested by the plant's enzymes. And then purple pitcher plant, this is actually the flower of the purple pitcher plant, which is pollinated by bees, but the leaves at the bottom of it, which are pitcher shaped, which I didn't include a photo of, are the devices. The modified leaves are the devices that insects are attracted into and then find themselves stuck by unable to climb out because of the hairs on the plant, and are then slowly digested. So we found those and a lot of other things. Scott wrote on a later program that we did. There were too numerous to mention the species. So tamaracks, poison sumac, which is an extremely high quality conservative plant, winterberry holly. We had these, again, all photos from Lydick Bog, steeplebush, Spirea tomentosa, blue flag iris, swamp rose. There's a lot. These are not really the rare things, but they're still very cool plants. So I want to talk about how we assess the value of plants and the ecological or the environmental integrity of a site. So there's Jerry Wilhelm again on the left. Back in 1979, he predominantly, but also with Swink in the plants of the Chicago region, devised this system called FQI, or Floristic Quality Index, based on a need that they were getting from people who were asking them as they were looking at a particular site to somehow grade its relative quality, the quality level. And so what they did is they assigned these C values, or coefficient of conservation, to all of the plants in the Chicago region that are native. If it's a non-native plant, it doesn't have a C value at all. So the C value goes on a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 being the species that are more tolerant of disturbance, the weedier species, if you will. And at the other end of the spectrum are the extremely high quality plants, which are the ones that are not able to typically live when there's been significant artificial disturbance done to a site. So in this example, the woodland sunflower, we see that growing along roadside edges. It won't grow anywhere. You typically see it in native woods, but it's not something that is only found in high quality natural remnants, unlike that orange fringed orchid. And so what happens if you see that little green circle up at the left, this is showing the level of site degradation. So on a site with low degradation, we might have all three of these plants present, right? But as the site becomes more and more degraded, we start losing the higher C value plants first. So that orange fringed orchid is the first thing to go away as the site becomes degraded. As it becomes more degraded, we may even lose the woodland sunflower. Think about like an old field or a agriculture field that's been taken out of agriculture. We'll typically see things like the tall goldenrod and other stuff like this. Common milkweed is a plant that is very tolerant of disturbances. Pokeweed, Phytolacca americana, is another one, kind of an early colonizing pioneer plant. We think of these as being weedy plants, but in likelihood, they're more abundant now than they were 200 years ago prior to settlement, because we have so much more disturbance. So what Wilhelm did was he took those C values and summed them up into the mean C values. So if we had 10 plants, we add up the C value of each plant, which the C value is assigned in their book, Plants of the Chicago Region, and we divide it by 10. That gives us the mean C. And then to factor in the size of the property and the number of species, he came up with the formula for FQI, which is the mean C times the square root of the number of plants. And in the plants of the Chicago region, they determined that a floristic quality index of 35 or higher is fairly confident the site has sufficient floristic quality to be at least of marginal natural area quality. FQI of 45 or higher is almost certain that the remnant has a natural area potential. So when Scott then ran the numbers, what found that day, and then he was back there again with another DNR ecologist and came up with a total of 85 species. This was just in the bog. 95% of them were native, which is pretty outstanding, considering we have so many invasive and exotic plants in our seed bank now. But the FQI was 60.8. So remember, 45 was considered like a high quality natural area. This was considered a very high natural quality area. So we knew that we had found something really sensational that day. And we wondered really how in the world it was possible that something like this could have escaped notice for so long. Back in the 1980s, the DNR commissioned an aerial survey over all of Indiana, every township of Indiana. Chamberlain Lake, which is another nature preserve in a part of that chain of lakes region, was one that they found in the 1980s as part of that aerial survey. Roger noted that they had visited the Lydick Bog property because the aerial survey showed that there was something potentially good there, but they didn't really, the ecologists who went there didn't note anything important about it. So we went to Chamberlain Lake afterwards. This is another, again, a very high quality state dedicated nature preserve. Following that day, I put together this map of the Lydick Bog. You can see that gray area in the middle is the bog itself. And I figured out who all the property owners were around there. And I sent this map to Shirley Heinze Land Trust. And interestingly enough, I sent it off with this cover sheet that said Lydick Bog and surrounding parcels, land ownership and history. As far as I can remember, that's the first time that the term Lydick Bog was ever used. So if I would have known that was going to become the permanent name, I probably would have thought of something a little bit more clever. It's actually a little bit north of Lydick, which is an unincorporated area just south of that property. And interestingly enough, if you look at the old plat maps in 1863, there was open water there. And even in 1895, it was open water, because that map, that lake, or what we know now as Lydick Bog, was identified as Beaver Lake. And funny enough, Lydick didn't exist in 1863. At the time, it was called Warren Center. And then in the 1880s, it was renamed Sweet Home, Indiana, before becoming Lydick in 1915. So this was a little fun that I had this morning with some photoshopping from the sign on Lydick Bog Preserve, thinking what it would have been if nobody would have renamed it in 1915. It could have been the Sweet Home Bog, right? Silly. Back in 2011 and 2012, Shirley Heinze Land Trust had expressed interest in moving over into St. Joe County. A group of us got together. We looked at a map of St. Joe County, and we put little magic markers on the wrote on the map of places that we thought were potentially high quality natural areas. And I didn't realize this until I looked at it this morning, but I actually wrote on that map. It's really hard to read down the bottom inset. The area where the Lydick Bog is at, I wrote marsh and wetlands on that map. So it was on my radar really for quite some time. And then this incredible sequence of events happened. I like to call it the perfect storm, but storms have negative connotations. The area that you see highlighted or filled in the transparent red is the Hurwich property, the largest property out there, which includes about 2/3 of the bog, went up for sale, 176 or 178 acres. Somebody who used to serve on the park board for St. Joe County called then St. Joe County Park Executive Director Evie Kirkwood and told her about this property, and she remembered hearing about it from our report, and she emailed me and said, I think that property that you and Scott looked at is for sale. And sure enough. So a year later, September 16th, 2015, I went back to the bog again with the Shirley Heinze Land Trust staff and their land acquisition committee. And we fought our way into the bog again, so the land acquisition committee could take a good look at it and see if it was something that was worthwhile. And of course, they all agreed that it was amazing. So that was the second time that I had actually been in the bog itself. And then the other part of the perfect storm was in 2016, it was the bicentennial of the state of Indiana. And back in 2011, the state established the Bicentennial Nature Trust with $20 million, which then received a $10 million match from the Lilly Endowment to be able to purchase land for conservation. And down in the bottom, State Representative Ryan Dvorak, who's my state rep and the state rep for the Lydick Bog, was someone who served on the committee for this in the House of Representatives. And so he was very instrumental in helping to secure the funding for this. And then Shirley Heinze Land Trust was able to raise more additional money through private and public partnerships. January 16th, 2015, at a meeting at Indiana University South Bend, Shirley Heinze Land Trust Executive Director Chris Kraus announced that the Land Trust had entered into a purchase agreement with the Hurwich family to be able to buy the property, and that they had secured the funding for the or either secured or were working on securing the funding for the Bicentennial Land Trust. And then August 26th, 2016, they had officially acquired the property. We had a little dedication ceremony You can see one of the old outbuildings there. This was on a 2-acre piece of property that was outside of that 178 acres that was not eligible for the bicentennial land trust money. So they had a not a 1-year option to purchase that property for $50,000, which they did eventually and raised the money. On that dedication day, some of the staff and some of the visitors got to go on a walk of the property. There was an old logging trail that went through there. New Year's Day 2017, I took this. You can still see some of these old buildings that are scattered around there. They had now owned all of them, but then it was going to cost an additional $40,000 to remove those buildings. We started coming up with ideas about what to do with this property, because 178 acres, only about 10 of which is bog, but we also had a sizable marsh. We had mesic upland woods. We had moist swampy woods, and as well as 30 acres that are in agriculture. So there's some different site conceptual plans. They tried to come up with some that would have utilized some of the old buildings. Inevitably, they're all torn down except for the one that remains standing, which they call the stewardship building. Here is a photo of the old farmstead house, which was built in the 1920s and not really useful for anything, and also full of lead paint and asbestos that all had to be remediated, or that could be torn down. And then August 16th of 2019, it received state dedication as a state dedicated nature preserve, which is the highest level of protection that a property can have by the state of Indiana. It gives oversight to the Indiana DNR Division of Nature Preserves as far as anything that can go on and take place at that site. We had obviously a huge turnout for that, and the community was enormously supportive of it. This has to be done by the Natural Resources, the State of Indiana Natural Resources Commission is the entity that approves a property as a state dedicated nature preserve. And since then, they've built some amenities with some funding from various sources. This is a pavilion that was, I want to say, paid for by a tourism grant from St. Joe County. This was the St. Joe Valley Master Gardeners group that I gave a tour to just a week ago out there. And of course, the boardwalk went in last year. And so now, from the first time, visitors are able to take an ADA accessible trail from the boardwalk, or excuse me, from the parking lot through the marsh down a boardwalk and then to the bog itself. So it probably took Scott and Roger and I a good, 40 minutes to fight our way through that vegetation to get to the bog. And now you can walk down there in a minute or two and see the same things that we did. This is actually, we talked about this a little bit before the meeting. These are folks from the South Bend Green Ribbon Commission who came out to get a tour of the bog. And then this is what the trail system looks like now. So I pulled this image off of Shirley Heinze's website. The black and white trail is an existing trail. And then the red area represents the new marsh boardwalk, and where it juts out and makes that little reverse L shape. It is the photo that I just showed you of the platform that leads into the bog itself. And then that purple area over on the right-hand side is a proposed, or not proposed, it's a future coming soon to the bog, a overlook over into that marsh area where there is some open water, and birds use that as a stopover point for migration, and sandhill cranes nest there. And that's it. I'm at 40 minutes and 23 seconds, but I'm going to end with something that we discussed shortly before in the last few days, the idea of doing a guided hike, a special guided hike for Northwest Indiana Green Drinks attendees. And so I'm gonna turn this over to Mari from Shirley Heinze Land Trust, and she's going to give you more details about this, but it's going to be, mark your calendars if you're interested in going out, and I'll forewarn you, it's about a 2-hour, a minimum, probably 90-minute to 2-hour walk and talk, depending on how detailed we get into going through the various ecosystems. We'll see woods, we'll see the bog itself, we'll see marsh, we'll talk about plants and everything that we see along the way. So that's going to be at 10 a.m. Central, 11 Eastern on Sunday, September 25th. And I am going to stop my sharing, and I'm going to turn this over to Mari, and I'll figure out how there we go. Stop the share.
And I think you could actually leave that screen up if people want to see the details. I did leave the link in the Zoom chat. I'm going to put them in the Facebook chat as well. And green drinkers, you kind of have exclusive access to this for the next few days, I'll say. So if it's a private event, so just put in that password, and we're asking folks to RSVP, please, so that we don't flood Steve with like 100 people at the boardwalk. As much as we love to see that many people out there, we want to also respect Steve's time and abilities. So, but I want to thank Steve for hosting hikes out at Lydick. It's been like almost like monthly throughout the summer, and we always get great turnout, and I just hear a lot of great things about his hikes. So I would encourage you all to sign up now if you can, and get this opportunity to take this hike with him.
I'd be happy to take any questions. I haven't looked at the chat, or somebody, if there are questions in the chat, maybe somebody would feed them to me, if not.
Yeah,
that's fine too.
Dylan or Katie, are you able to feed any questions that have come through either the chat here on Zoom, or if anybody's dropped anything into Facebook comments?
Yes, I am looking now. I'm looking at the chat here. We have lots of great comments for Steve. Let's see if we have okay. Brian Will wants to know what type of animals and wildlife are in the bog.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I didn't mention animals at all, and trying to scrunch this down into 40 minutes, there just wasn't time to talk about more plants and animals. But there are a couple of notable things there. Blandings turtles, which are state endangered and a candidate, I believe, for federal endangerment, have been found. Our state herpetologist was there doing surveys a few years ago, and somewhere I have a picture of a Blandings turtle that was found there. There are, again, sandhill cranes. I haven't looked recently to see how many bird species have been documented there, but it is a birding hotspot. There are lots of birders who come there. It's a important migratory stopover for both waterfowl as well as passerines or perching birds. Again, sandhill cranes nest there. Red-tailed hawks are very common. Woodcock are there. Cricket frogs are also there. Cricket frogs are either rare or extirpated from most of the Chicago region now, but they exist in this Kettle Lakes region, the Chain Lakes region, at least at Lydick Bog and Mud Lake, and also at Chamberlain Lake. There's coyote, of course, deer, I'm sure fox, and numerous other things.
Thank you for that. We also have a Facebook question from Debbie. She wants to know if there are any major differences between Lydick Bog and Pinhook Bog.
Yeah, the plants are different, are somewhat different, but like that orange fringed orchid that I showed you is one. The Platanthera is not. We've not seen that in Lydick Bog, but it is at Pinhook, and some of those other orchids that I listed at that are at Lydick are found nowhere else in the area here. So it's very similar. Like bogs really only have a limited number of plants that can survive in them. So we'll see things like high bush blueberry common to both places, and we'll see some of those carnivorous plants, the purple pitcher plant and sundew, and bladderwort is another one that are going to be found at both of those bogs. So they're similar, but they overlap quite a bit, but they each have unique things to their own properties.
Awesome. So let's see. Victoria would like to know, have you seen Baltimore checker spot butterflies or their host plant at Lydick Bog?
I have not. Their host plant would be turtlehead, and I'm not sure that I have seen turtlehead at Lydick Bog. I don't recall seeing it there, but I don't have the complete botanical inventory either for that property. So no, I have seen I saw an American snout butterfly, which aren't particularly rare, but it's one that I've never seen before. And I saw that there about a month or so ago. And I had a group from Notre Dame, some transfer students from University of Dublin who were with me. And I was super excited to see the American snout butterfly, which is almost a prehistoric butterfly. It's a specialist on hackberry trees. And there are fossilized evidence of snouts and hackberries that go back millions of years, literally.
That's really cool. Okay. And we have Beth who wants to know, so if it was a lake in 1860, does that mean that the bog has only existed since then?
Yeah, I think so. Now, how much open water there was in the 1860s, and they even called it, so it was originally called Beaver Lake, and then later on in the 1910s, if you look at the plat books there, it was called Wolverton Lake, and the person who owned the property there was named Wolverton. He was an early industrialist, and so even as late as like the 19 teens, it was still listed on the maps as being a lake. So there no doubt would have been some open water there. How much, we don't really know, because nobody really wrote any good records that we've seen about it. But I would consider it to be a young bog. So eventually, over time, the sediment that floats up on top of the bog will start falling to the bottom, and it will eventually fill in and cease to become a bog. So a bog is kind of this midway process between a lake and a forest, but we'll not see that happen anytime soon. So, but I would consider it to be a young bog, yes.
And that's a great lead into our next question from Katie. Do you think there are still many bogs out there to be discovered, or is it an unusual occurrence?
They're more common farther north than they are here. So in Indiana, we're just kind of we're really at the southern edge of where the bogs are at. But the northeastern portion of Indiana has more potential for that sort of ecosystem due to the glaciation. Then if you go farther south in Indiana, everything's flat and there just aren't any bogs. But to answer the question of whether or not there are still places like this that remain to be seen, yeah, not in St. Joe County anyway. I think we've really looked at that pretty darn closely, but it's possible, particularly if once you get a little bit farther north into some of the more rural areas of Michigan or Wisconsin or Minnesota or areas like that. But their natural areas are becoming less and less common, really, and I've seen tremendous amounts of change in just my own lifetime, and the number of places that have gone from really what I would consider to be natural or semi-natural to developed. And really, with this, Shirley Heinze latched onto this property as soon as it went up for sale. I don't ever recall there being a for sale sign on this property, but it would have been catastrophic if somebody would have bought that and maybe wanted to put a subdivision or use it as a property for their own huge homestead or something like that, which I guess would be better than building houses up along it. But it would be considered prime real estate, I think, because based on the views that were there, but thankfully that didn't happen.
Thankfully. Okay, we have one more question from Facebook, and then I want to open it up to anyone who might want to unmute themselves and ask a question. So Lance wants to know, what types of owls are at Lydick?
I have not seen or heard an owl at Lydick Bog, but I also don't typically go there at night. I would imagine that we would have great horned owls there and screech owls there. Barred owls are more crepuscular or diurnal, where they'll sometimes you'll hear them calling and in the late afternoon and the dusk. But I've never heard a barred owl at Lydick Bog. But again, I live right down the street from there, and I have I have great horned owls and I have screech owls, so I'm certain that those two are at Lydick Bog.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Steve. So does anyone want to ask Steve a question that I have not covered here in the chat?
I would like to do that if I may, Dylan.
Of course.
I noticed there were two properties that were on the furthest other side of Lydick Bog, and they looked like they were privately owned.
Yeah.
So my question is, what's the potential of those being purchased and included in the nature preserve?
Yes. So when we have a high quality natural area like this, it's not only important to protect that property itself, but also to have some buffering as well. So you're right, only about 2/3 of the actual bog is in protected status by Shirley Heinze Land Trust. There was a little tiny parcel that's like 1/3 of an acre in the middle of the bog. I have no idea how in the world this could have ever been subdivided like that, but somebody owns that. And I think it actually went up for a tax sale a few years ago, and somebody else grabbed it before Heinze could get it. But they're not buildable sites, of those two that are on the edge of the bog. But then if we go a little bit further to the west, we see a lot of different platted out land over there, and that area over there is very hilly, and portions of it are very swampy, and a lot of the houses that are over there seem to have just kind of been slowly swallowed up over time. I mean, there are some buildable areas, but there's a lot of things that have just kind of been abandoned, probably because of the water table and whatnot. So there is certainly potential for acquiring more land around there. I think the priority right now would be the rest of the bog, obviously, if that should ever come up for sale. What we didn't show on the map there is that east of the bog, the Chain of Lakes Conservation Club owns a fair amount of property, and then past them, the Airport Authority owns some additional property that they used to be agriculture. It's not high quality. It's new growth now. And then beyond that is the new location of the South Bend Chocolate Factory and Dinosaur Museum. And that is somehow probably going to factor into this area conservation plan, where potentially there could be some larger trails that would lead out of Lydick Bog, maybe potentially over onto that airport property, maybe potentially over onto the chocolate company property. So there's a lot of work yet to be done.
Thank you, Steve, for that very important realization that these precious areas do need those buffer zones. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask to transition rather quickly. Mari, if you would let us know of other events that Shirley Heinze Trust is, sponsoring within the next couple of months, and then we'll go to Katie, who's going to follow up with what is happening with Save the Dunes, because I do want to leave people with events that they could potentially take part in. Okay, Mari?
Yes,
Quickly.
hi. Thank you, Nancy. So kind of our big thing this summer is Nature and the Arts. We actually just had one at Lydick Bog last Saturday and had a lot of great turnout. And the idea with those is to create family-friendly events, for kids and adults, and you make your own craft and get to take it home with you in the beauty of the outdoors. So our next Nature and the Arts event is September 24th at our main office at Meadowbrook in Valparaiso. And then we're going to have another Nature and the Arts October 1st at Ivanhoe South. So keep your eyes out for that. And let me also drop the link to our events website. And I also just scheduled a virtual Nature and the Arts event for later in October. So that's going to be a fun creative workshop. And I also want to plug in our volunteer events. So for any of those who follow us, Meadowbrook Mondays were paused for a while, but they are resumed. We have a great new volunteer coordinator. And so if you want to come and help us out so that we can continue doing land conservation, come and join us the first and third Monday of every month.
Mari, I'm going to cut you off there because I want Katie to have an opportunity. Okay, Katie, please take it away.
All right, here we go. We've got 4 events coming up. first is our Monarch Music and More. This is a wonderful event, September 18th from 1 to 4:30 p.m. at Brewery Lodge in Michigan City. Live music, food, drinks, great afternoon, great people. I will put the link in the chat. Next, we have a photography hike as part of the Indiana Dunes National Parks Outdoor Adventure Fest. That's coming up next Friday on September 9th. It's at 10 a.m. at West Beach, and we have a Facebook event, so I'll put that in the chat as well. And then a couple save the dates. So on October 8th, we're doing a tour of Barker House, where our headquarters is in Michigan City, and then a hike in Barker Woods. I'm going to have some s'mores and very fun time. So save the date, October 8th. And then our Dunes 5K back in person this year, November 5th. So stay involved with Save the Dunes to get more information on those events.
Thank you very much. And I want to announce our next Northwest Indiana Green Drinks event, which will be happening on, how is that erased? Okay, okay, it's here. It's October 6th, which is always the first Thursday of the month. Susan Mihailo of Save the Dunes is going to be talking about the wonderful and enthusiastic and inspiring founder of Save the Dunes, Dorothy Buell. So you'll want to join us for that. It's going to be extremely interesting, very exciting, and hopefully we'll figure out how to build in the interactiveness of that that happened the first time she presented that for the Ogden Dunes Historical Society, which was for a very limited group of people. So without Dorothy Buell, there would be not only no Save the Dunes, we would have no Indiana Dunes National Park. So that's how significant she was to our area and also to conservation. I want to be respectful of people's time. We've gone approximately 10 to 15 minutes over what we usually do. So everybody, just thank you for joining us this evening. We hope you'll join us next month in October for another presentation and another opportunity to interact and share with like-minded people. Like Kathy Sipple said, we have found our tribe, so let's invite others to expand our tribe. And Steve, just from the bottom of my heart, thank you so very much for all of the research you do every single time you have presented to Northwest Indiana Green Drinks. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. I'll also add that next Saturday, the 10th, we're also doing a hike sort of with Shirley Heinze with at one of their preserves as part of the Indiana Dunes Outdoor Festival. So Katie mentioned that. So if you go to the Indiana Dunes Outdoor Festival website, there will be information on that. I'm co-leading a hike there at the John Merle Coulter Preserve over in just outside of Gary. And then we're going to go over to West Beach and hike the Succession Trail. So folks here are also welcome to join us for that as well.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. And Katie and Dylan, if you would just stay on a little bit for our little debrief, I would greatly appreciate it. Everybody enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thanks, everyone.